Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is the Freedman's Bureau, and we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you go to read more and learn more about what this organization and program was able to accomplish and struggled with, you should kind of key in on these to get a sense of really what was going on. So let's get into it. The first is the Freedman's Bureau Act. Now, there were a couple of different pieces of legislation, some that went back and forth in committees between the Congress and the Senate between 1863 into 1865 and then finally in 1866. And when the legislation was finally enacted, it was, of course, had been vetoed by President Andrew Johnson, who took over following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And Johnson was someone who so, of course, he's from Tennessee. He's someone who, certainly is a believer. He's not a radical Republican. He doesn't particularly hold to views of racial equality. Not that all radical Republicans did at the time, but he certainly does not. He really felt that the idea or the mission of the Freedmen's Bureau was in some ways catering to one particular race over another, and since as that was not white individuals, he had a real problem with the Freedmen's Bureau, and so he vetoes it, but Congress, overrides. They get enough votes to override. This means that the Freedmen's Bureau is now going to go into effect, and the mission essentially of the Freedmen's Bureau was to accomplish a few things. It's to send agents largely into areas where you have high percentages of the population are formerly enslaved peoples. And the goal is partly to provide them with material aid, humanitarian aid, to be able to get them aid. Secondly, to be able to provide them with assistance in the economic marketplace. To advocate and oversee court cases, and as well to provide for opportunities for education. And there's a number of others as well, but this is generally what, much of what they're going to be doing. So the second thing then for us, I guess, would be labor contracts. So the Freedmen's Bureau saw itself as a program or institution where it could act to facilitate labor contracts between formerly enslaved peoples and plantation owners and others, immediately following the Civil War. The difficulty here, of course, is that the process by which many of these contracts are going to be signed can be quite fraught, it's quite gendered, and the functional result of this can be and was the creation of a very repressive sharecropping system, and is occurring right at the time in the year or two aftermath of the war itself, where, in some ways this is legitimizing slavery in some ways. So these labor contracts are difficult. Third, O.O. Howard, or Oliver Howard. Oliver Howard was a U.S. Army general, was someone who was supportive of sort of the radical Republican views of the purposes of the war for the United States, and who was seen as very pious for his day. And so he's put in charge he's a white individual, he's put in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, beginning around 1865, and, is in charge of it for about 8 or 9 years. And he's someone who Andrew Johnson struggles with immensely over this, because Johnson is not a fan of the Freedmen's Bureau at all. He thinks that it is a sort of broad monarchical usurping of power and this kind of thing, and Johnson is very, very against it. Fourth, the American Missionary Association. So part of what the Freedmen's Bureau, of course, is doing is engaging in federally sanctioned humanitarian aid and relief, and the federal government relied on assistance from private organizations, missionary organizations, and others to assist these efforts. They expected this, they worked sort of with them, and the American Missionary Association is one of these to help promote the creation of Freedmen's schools. Now, these are, of course, quite quite gendered, but they do in many cases bear fruit in many public schools being planted for formerly enslaved peoples, and in some cases these would result in the creations of universities such as Howard and others. The fifth term for us is going to be the KKK, right? So the Freedmen's Bureau was this political this politicized institution that exists in the U.S. in the first decades after the Civil War, especially in 1865, 6, 7, and 8, where you have those opposed to really any form of racial equality or any form of assistance or any form of reconstruction on the part of the federal government, looking at the Freedmen's Bureau as this cabal that supports black community over what all of this kind of thing. So it's very strongly opposed by the Democrats. It's very strongly opposed by former white Confederates, obviously. And this is, of course, all occurring at a time where you've got military occupation of these former Confederate states, and you've got the growth of vigilante racialized militias in the South led by the Ku Klux Klan, who begin carrying out acts of ritual violence against formerly enslaved people and against anyone who is seen as a form of institutional support to those people. And so, of course, Freedmen's Bureau individuals and anyone who got aid from them, in some cases would be seen as a target. And this is, of course, what contributes to an increase in troop levels to try to go after the KKK, throughout the South in the 1870s. All right. Thank you so very much.